Welcome to this video from the Consultants Development Institute. I'm Carter McNamara, an instructor with the Institute and the presenter in this video. Let's talk about the outcomes that we're aiming for in this video. First is to establish some principles to always consult in the most effective and successful manner. And you'll also be equipped to carefully define that success with your clients in your consulting projects. You'll establish powerful principles to always consult in the most fair, honest, and ethical manner, and you'll be able to recognize and manage the legal liabilities and risks inherent in almost any type of consulting. And finally, you'll know what to carefully think about if you're ultimately faced with leaving a consulting project. So let's start looking at those principles for effective consulting. It's very important for professional consultants to be clear to themselves and to their clients about what it takes to be effective and successful in every project, especially projects to solve complex problems or to accomplish significant change in your client's organization. Regardless of the nature of the project, there are certain principles that always apply. And we'll look at some of those here, but at first, I'd like to ask you to pause and reflect on what you think are at least two key principles for successful consulting. And while you do that, you can pause the video. There's a button in the bottom left-hand corner. If you pause on the video and pull out your journal and do some reflecting, much like you did in the earlier courses. When you're done, you can press that same button and resume. And then we'll talk about my ideas and others that I've read that are principles for effective consulting. The first principle that we suggest is that the answer to complex problems lies between the consultant and the client. The answer emerges during the project as they work collaboratively to address problems and to learn at the same time. And another principle is to recognize and encourage diverse values and perspectives. An experienced consultant remembers that there are many different perspectives on an issue in an organization, and those perspectives should be encouraged and explored because they often lead to much more accurate understanding and therefore more effective problem solving in organizations. When working with clients, start from where they are now. That means that you want to understand the client's perspective on their issues, including what they've tried, what has worked, what has not worked, what they think should be done now. It's better to go slower with the client than to go faster without them. And there is no blame in consulting situations. When problems seem overwhelming and people disagree about how to solve them, they sometimes start to blame each other for causing those problems. But an atmosphere of blame only serves to inhibit the trust and the collaboration, the commitment necessary to successfully address problems in an organization. And another useful principle is to come to the project with at least one systematic, planned approach to consulting in mind. That approach is useful not only to systematically address issues, but as a common frame of reference when talking with the client about the project. The consultant should be willing to modify that framework as he works with his clients. In an earlier course, Roles, Goals, and Reasons, we talked about that systematic approach to consulting. A very enlightening principle is that the consultant's value is really in the flow of the process, not in the details of the project. The client will highly value the project if both the consultant and client continue to work in a highly respectful and collaborative relationship to improve the client's organization. So let's look at some more. Success comes from who you are as much as from your expertise. And this is true especially if the client perceives the consultant to be respectful and authentic and always focused on achieving results and learning for the client. One of the most powerful influences that consultants can have with clients is to model the behaviors that the consultant wants from the client. The next principle is simply to do what you say you are going to do. In the midst of clients' sometimes confusion and anxieties during a project, the consultant can help a great deal by remaining grounded and centered, clear and consistent. And that approach builds trust and commitment with the client. Don't tell your clients to do something just because you said so. The consultant should first explain the advice and then the benefits that come from following that advice. Then the consultant should listen to the client, to his reactions and feedback, and to his own advice. It is up to the client to use the advice or not. And this is sometimes one of the hardest principles for new consultants to accept. It helps to remember that people learn only what they are really ready to learn. A critical principle is for the consultant to really know herself. She is an instrument of change with the client, so she should understand herself and her effect on her clients, including any effects from her consulting style and her biases. In an upcoming course, we'll talk about the importance of understanding yourself as a consultant. And finally, don't take it personally. Often clients struggle with issues because of their own roles in those issues. They may not want to change themselves and might resist the consultant's attempts to change them. In those instances, the consultants should remember that those responses are the client's choices, not the consultant's. It'd be very useful to very briefly reflect on the many suggestions that you've heard now. So again, get ready to pause this video and answer maybe these two questions. Which principles really stood out for you? And were there any that just didn't seem appropriate to you? Now let's talk about how you can define project success, because we talked about principles to ensure success. Let's talk about how you can even derive what that even really is. Might success be that the results listed in the contract were achieved? Both you and your client should specify in a written agreement what the overall results are that the project is to achieve. Describe them in terms that you both could readily detect during the project. Or is success when the problem is solved? Sometimes as you and your client work together, you both realize that there's more important problems to address than those specified in the contract. In that case, be sure to document the newly desired results in the contractor agreement as well. Is success that the project finished on time and within budget? Often your client has very limited resources in terms of money and time. Therefore, your client might consider any project done within schedule and budget to be as important as solving the client's problem. Is success that you and your client had a high-quality working relationship? You want your relationship with your client to be as open, honest, and trusting as possible. That kind of relationship keeps strong, ongoing commitment and participation in the project itself, which in turn is most likely to really end up solving your client's problem. Is success that your client learns to solve similar problems by themselves in the future? And this outcome should be one of the major goals for any consultant. In any project, try and involve your client in your activities so they are more likely to learn to solve the problems well into the future for themselves. Is success that your client says that they'd hire you again? One of the most powerful outcomes is that you both are willing to work with each other again. However, be careful about this, because an ethical consideration for any consultant is to always avoid creating dependency of the client to always be needing the consultant. So again, take a minute, record in your journal, what is success to you and what is success to your clients? How might you work with your client to discern what project success is? Because there's many different ways that success might be defined. Now let's look at some principles for ethical consulting. So far we talked about how to ensure success in any consulting project and how to work with clients to get very specific on what success really is. But it's also very important that consultants establish some major principles or guideposts to ensure that they consult in a manner that is always fair, honest, and ethical. Let's look at some of those. But again, before we do, it's useful for you to pause and try identify at least two, maybe, principles for ethical consulting. For example, treat others as you want them to treat you. So press the pause button in the bottom left corner of the video, and after you've written your two principles, we'll resume the video and I'll tell you some of the things that I think and what I've read. The first ethical principle is common to many professions, and that's to do no harm to your client. That principle should guide everything you do in your client's organization. It's a principle that's included in professional ethics of numerous professions. Keep client information private, unless the client or law requests otherwise. One of the best tools that a consultant has is his reputation. And if he shares client information that should have been kept private, he not only could lose a lawsuit, he could lose his reputation, and that's just as bad. And never arrange for your client to always depend on you. Primary working assumptions of professional consultants are that the client's choices must be free and open, and that all decisions in a project always require accurate and complete information. Any overdependence is likely to inhibit the open exchange of information that's necessary for a successful project, as we talked about in the earlier roles course. And always anticipate and avoid conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest is representing two opposing interests at once, and a consultant should always do those actions that first benefit the client rather than the consultant. Let's look at some more principles. Do not act as an advocate for your client. That is, do not act in the official capacity to represent your client to other stakeholders. For example, again, a consultant should not meet with a potential investor or funder to convince him of the credibility of the client's organization. The client should do that herself. Don't go beyond your own expertise. If you aren't sure about how to address a situation, then you should say, I don't know. You should not risk the health of your client's organization, and your reputation by taking unnecessary risks. And do not skip the diagnosis or the discovery phase of consulting. The consultant should not jump to conclusions about the real causes of problems in the client's organization. Instead, the consultant and client should form conclusions from the facts that they found from investigating the client's problem. And finally, treat others the way that you want them to treat you. And that principle needs no explanation, yet it's at the core of every ethical principle in probably most professions. I want to share with you a tool that I've used. Sometimes I'll even talk to clients about that, and they'll use it with me to develop maybe a code of ethics even for the project. And if you downloaded the handouts, this is the handout that you saw. It's very handy, again, to talk about it with clients. But as a professional consultant, you should have your own code of ethics. And I'm hoping that you can pause your journal again and give this some thought. Maybe even look up the handout, and is there anything that you would add, anything that you would take away? One of the best ways to convey ethical principles, there I mentioned the code of ethics, but one of the best ways is to give examples of unethical behaviors. And I'll give you some examples of what I've seen, but one is to be always agreeing with the client. It's unethical for the consultant to always agree in order to avoid conflict, for example, as if that builds a wonderful relationship with the client. In projects where there is a significant issue, it's possible that the client himself is part of the issue, and the consultant isn't helping the organization by ignoring the client's role. Instead, the consultant should be authentic and tactfully ask the client about his role in the situation. And it's unethical for a consultant to offer advice well beyond his expertise, for example, simply to impress the client. In that situation, the consultant's risking the health of the client and of his own most prized possession, his reputation. Consultants should never make conclusions beyond what the evidence shows, simply to enhance the consultant's credibility or just to get things moving in the project. Again, the consultant is needlessly risking the health of the organization and, again, his reputation. Another example of unethical behavior is not telling the whole story, lest the client disagree with the consultant's advice. Here's one of the most egregious examples. If a consultant firmly believes from his investigations or his discovery that the client needs a certain type of help, but that's not the help that the client is really going to accept or the type of help that the consultant's really good at, so the consultant suggests something different for the client that would be more acceptable to both, but probably won't solve the problem. That occurs more than you think, and it's a lie. It's a lie of omission. And we'll look at some more. Not terminating the project when the results were achieved. Sometimes a consultant, in fact, wants the work. Sometimes the client likes the consultant, and so they'll stick together working on the same project over and over and over again. But the client might soon sense that something just isn't right in their relationship and that there's an unhealthy dependency, and might end up firing the consultant anyway. It's unethical to share confidential information with outside stakeholders, and this is very dangerous and perhaps illegal, especially if the contract between the consultant and client specifies that confidential information will always be protected. In that case, the consultant could risk a lawsuit. The following principle might not be clear to some people, but sharing information with the client's boss without telling the client first is unethical. The consultant's relationship with the client is the foundation for success in a project, and the consultant should not share information with her boss unless it's very clear that she has indeed committed a very improper or even illegal act, and that applies especially to internal consultants. So for the external consultant, if he's working with a vice president, he should not go to the president unless he's given the vice president a chance to address the issue as well. The consultant should inform the client about the consultant's ethical principles so the client knows what to expect from the consultant. And the client can consider those principles for the project as well. Ethical principles are extremely important for professional consultants. So again, I strongly encourage you, pause the video, give this some thought. What might be your code of ethics? Are you in a situation that is unethical now and you want to do something about it? Next, we'll talk about managing risks in consulting. And we've talked about how to ensure and how to define success in projects and reviewed key principles for ethical consulting. But now let's look at various risks that still might occur, even if you have sound principles for successful and ethical consulting. But this video is for you, and you learn again primarily by pausing, by thinking, reflecting, and you've got your journal for that. So what is the biggest potential liability in consulting you might think about? And then compare that again to what you're hearing. But when we share our advice, I want to be clear in this video just to protect ourselves. So I'm actually doing good liability protection here in proclaiming that the contents of the presentation are not legal advice. And I'm from the company Authenticity Consulting, and we do not assume any liability or responsibility for your interpretation or your application of information originating from this presentation. The first area of risks that we'll talk about is managing boundaries during a consulting project. The best place to start in minimizing risks around boundaries is to have a written agreement. The agreement between the consultant and client should have a section that clearly specifies the roles and responsibilities of each. External consultants should complete a mutually signed agreement, whether it's a written contract or a letter of agreement. Internal consultants should work from a clear agreement with the client's department in the organization. The agreement should specify the nature and scope of the services, for example, strategic planning, facilitation, and any preparation, how those services will be delivered and where and when, and how they will be evaluated. It should specify the client's role, for example, to announce the planning, recruit participants, provide a venue, write the plan, evaluate the planning sessions, and provide evaluation results to the consultant, each within certain time periods. The consultant and client should stay within the roles of that agreement. For example, if the client asks the consultant to facilitate board development within the same agreement as facilitating strategic planning, then the consultant should decline, even if both agree that board work is needed more than the plan. Whenever the consultant or client requests a change in the nature or scope of services, then a new agreement should be finalized that includes the new roles and responsibilities. This might be referred to as recontracting. The new agreement should include clear evidence that both parties agreed to the new agreement. If work is done outside of the agreement, it could cause project creep, as it's often called, which occurs when the project continues to expand. Eventually, the project loses its focus and often its effectiveness when the consultant and client no longer know who is doing what and when. Work outside the scope of the agreement could also cause an unhealthy dependency between consultant and client. That's contrary to the consultant's professional obligation to help clients be more self-reliant in solving their own problems. For the external consultant, work outside the scope of the agreement could result in a lawsuit when the client refuses to pay for work that was not specified in the agreement. So, are you confident that your standard consulting contract minimizes all areas of risk? You might get your contract reviewed by a legal expert. After all, you'll likely be using that same contract in your future consulting projects. So now's the time to make sure that contract takes care of all potential liabilities. Another area around boundaries is when consultants are sometimes asked to act as supervisors of employees. And the first concern is if you do that, you always want to make sure that's in the agreement and you want to understand the personnel policies. And I'll explain. A supervisor is someone who has the authority to oversee the productivity and the progress of employees who direct reportedly to him or her. A supervisor should always follow up-to-date and approved personnel policies about which all employees have been trained. If a supervisor does not follow those policies, then the organization and the supervisor could be sued, for example, for discrimination or harassment. So a consultant, whether internal or external, is putting herself at risk if she officially assumes the role of supervisor without that role being very clearly specified and without having read the personnel policies very closely. But a bigger concern for the external consultant is the question, why didn't the client have an employee be the supervisor? The consultant should pose that question to the client and be satisfied with the client's answer. When an external consultant is hired to supervise employees, that's often referred to as a form of employment contract. And if this does occur, there should be a very good reason for any client to do that. If the consultant and the client both agree that the consultant should officially assume the role of supervisor, then the roles and responsibilities should again be specified in a formal agreement, and the consultant should realize that she is no longer consulting, she's now managing. And the external consultant also should be very careful that a governing agency doesn't determine that the consultant should be classified as an employee rather than an independent contractor. We'll talk about that concern soon in this video, but let's look at some more boundary issues. When the internal or external consultant and the client first meet to clarify the desired outcomes of the goals of the project, they should also talk about any organizational resources that will be needed by the consultant and how she might use them. Those types of resources should be specified in the formal agreement as well. And for example, if the consultant needs to interact with certain employees in certain job roles, then she should be clear to the client about which employee roles she will need to work with, why and when. And then the client should notify each of those employees about the upcoming interactions with the consultant and mention the benefits of those interactions to the employees. The consultant should also notify the client shortly before attracting or interacting with any of those employees. I'm not an expert on insurances, but I have some experience and I know some of the key things to mention here. But I'm going to suggest that you should still talk to your insurance agent. Here are some of the insurances that I know that different consultants have had to give attention to. And one is general liability insurance. And that type of insurance can protect the consultant in case a client is injured in the facility, whether it's his office or home. And many clients will require that the external consultant carries a general liability policy with a specified amount of coverage. Clients might also require other types of coverage, such as automobile liability or errors and omissions or fidelity or surety bond. Sometimes clients are willing to negotiate the need for some of these coverages, but again, it's always wise for the consultant to review her insurances with her insurance agent, because consulting is a very diverse set of activities and therefore could be subject to different types of liabilities. So you might pause, write down any concerns you might have or questions about your own insurances. I wanted to mention some of the kinds of illegal activities that you might encounter, and by that I'm going to transition you then into some suggestions about how to deal with some of these when you encounter them. So despite having a clearly written agreement, a consultant still might encounter activities in the organization that clearly are illegal or seem questionable. And let's look at some of the types of illegal activities that can occur. Misappropriation of funds occurs when the company has a designated amount of money for a specific purpose but spends it on something else. So for example, if a nonprofit spends donations meant for adult daycare on building a building instead. And fraud, of course, is dishonestly acquiring something of value. For example, if the consultant charged the client for services that he really didn't actually perform. And theft, of course, is taking something that is someone else's and it's not your own, but claiming it as your own. For example, if the client or consultant used the other's intellectual property without the other's consent. And there are many employment laws, and it seems their number is increasing. That's why personnel policies must be kept up to date and all employees must be informed of them. An example of this type of issue would be treating someone unfairly in the workplace because of his or her gender, age, or disability. Breach of contract means not meeting the terms that are specified in a contract between parties. For example, not conducting a sufficient number of trainings, even though the consultant has already been paid for the trainings. I've mentioned some questionable and even illegal practices, and I'm going to give you my advice for what I have seen. Again, I'm not an attorney, but I've used this advice and it's been useful for me. So the first is, if you encounter a practice that is now directly causing harm to a person, then you should attempt to intervene if that can be done safely, and then you should promptly contact the appropriate legal authorities. And by that I mean if somebody's being attacked, for example, and then notify the client. If you're an external consultant, or if you're an internal, obviously notify your supervisor. Otherwise, if the practice is not causing direct harm to a person now, then as a consultant, she should consider the following courses. Describe the situation to the client, if the consultant is an external consultant, or to the consultant's supervisor, if the consultant is an internal. The description should be based primarily on the evidence of what she saw or heard, not only just on her gut feeling, and she should ask for a response back to her within a certain time frame. The more egregious the practice, the shorter the time frame. Document who it is you're talking with, and document the results of what you said. Document the results of your conversation. Keep a date on that. If the client or the supervisor does not respond appropriately to her within that time frame, then she should escalate the situation to a higher level in the client's organization or supervisor's organization. Explain the situation and ask them to respond appropriately to her within a time frame. And again, she should document the conversation back to whoever she spoke with. If that higher level does not respond appropriately to her within the time frame, then she should consult an attorney. Again, these are general guidelines. The nature of the response depends on the situation, and ultimately the response depends on the good judgment of the consultant. I'm going to talk now about what seems to be an increasing concern, especially in the United States, and I'm noticing even in Canada. And there is an increasing attention in government agencies like the Internal Revenue Service in the United States or Canada Revenue Agency about whether an external consultant should be classified as an independent consultant or really as an employee. And I'll explain. So external consultants and clients should be very careful about the nature of their working relationship and that it legally qualifies the consultant as an independent contractor. If the consultant is not deemed by the appropriate government agency to be an independent contractor, then that agency might impose substantial fees and penalties on both the consultant and the client. And in that case, the penalties and the fees could be substantial. So the agency is concerned that the client is trying to avoid paying employee taxes and benefits by declaring the person a consultant rather than an employee. So what you always want to do then is contact the IRS, for example, in the United States, or in Canada, Canada Revenue Agency, and they're going to ask, or they're going to want to know for sure, does the organization that you're working for as your client, are they directing how you're doing your job, or are they just telling you the results to be achieved? Do you have other clients, in fact? If you have other clients, that tends to point that you probably are really an independent consultant. Are you stationed permanently in your client's organization? Because if you are, that might suggest again that you might be actually an employee. But the ultimate thing you want to do, and this doesn't always cover your case, but you want to specify a relationship in the formal agreement, and it should include a paragraph that specifies that the consultant is an independent contractor and why. But that only covers you partially. You want to listen to my advice I said earlier. And I think it's always wise to just contact the IRS. You could probably find their terms for an independent contractor on the website, and probably the same for Canada Revenue. You might stop now and again think about, are you really working for one client continually? Do you have an office in that place? Are you directing employees? If that's the case, then you want to be careful. I would suggest you look at the IRS website or Canada Revenue and look at their terms for determining if somebody is an independent contractor or not, and then decide for yourself. There might be times, even though you've got principles for successful consulting and ethical principles, where you just are faced ultimately with deciding to leave the project or not. So, for example, your client no longer has funds to pay you. You've encountered continued resistance from various members of the client's organization despite your attempts to address them. Or maybe the quality of a relationship with your client has greatly deteriorated. Or if you've encountered sustained unethical practices that you just really can't live with. So you might ask yourself some hard questions before you decide to leave. And the first is really, have you really tried hard to address the issues with your client? For example, have you had an authentic discussion with your client about your concerns? What resources have you tapped? Have you asked any peers for feedback to address your issues with your client? And what else might you still do? What will be the impact on your client's organization if you leave? Realize the effects might be dramatic. For example, members of the organization might conclude that their problem is so hopeless that even you chose to leave. Have you discussed this situation with peers, for example, to ensure that you are really aware of any hurt or damage that you might be causing your client if you leave? What are the alternatives for your client? Can your client bring in another consultant? How would that transition from you to the new consultant occur? What if your client does nothing? Are there actions that you can recommend that your client can undertake in the short term or even the long term? How might this affect your reputation? One of the most important assets of any consultant is his or her reputation. And it is surprising how small a local community of businesses and consultants can really be. Particularly if your client has strong negative feelings about you and you're leaving, word can spread quickly, causing substantial damage to your reputation and your credibility as a consultant. What can you learn from this situation? How did you get yourself into it? What could you have done differently? What might you do differently in the future? Is there any learning that you can share with your client? If so, be careful to offer it as feedback from you, not as judgments about them. And what are the terms in your contract? Contracts often specify terms of project termination. For example, a sentence such as, either party can terminate this contract with at least 30 days written notice to the other party. Are there other clauses that pertain? For example, clauses about penalties or reimbursement or damages. If you've thoroughly addressed the above listed questions and still decide to leave the project, then comply with those terms. Be sure to notify at least 2 people in your client's organization, and don't go into extended analysis of the cause of your leaving. Instead, mention for personal reasons or because I can no longer be helpful to the client. Are there any reasons that you have or might have to quit a project? Now is the time to be thinking about it before you get yourself into that situation. So again, a moment to pause. What will you do if you encounter a questionable practice? Are you indeed an independent contractor, as we talked about? And are you sure? Thank you for your time. Thank you for attending. If you have any questions, you can email us at info@consultantsdevelopmentinstitute.org.